The question we are asking is the question of capacity. We are asking the question of ability. The question is not whether we are capable of critical thought, but whether the extent of our criticism can escape a certain level of bias. Now, to do this, we must ask ourselves what it means to be biased. For here, we are speaking of that which has control. We are speaking of psychology. We are speaking of social conditioning, a mechanism of determination. The channel of a stream directs its course. So too, our prejudice, so too, our bias directs the course of our thought. Is it possible, then, to be free of one's conditioning, to be free of the channels which have been set in the mind? When we say critical thinking, it would seem we mean thought according to our conditioning. It would seem we mean to think critically within the preset channels of the mind. This is indeed a large problem. For does one prove that one is free of conditioning, or that one has escaped conditioning, simply by manifesting a consciousness of critical thought? What does it mean to be biased? Does it not signify a certain kind of prejudice? That we are in favor of one stone as opposed to another? It means we are leaning more or less toward a particular conclusion, proposition, or affirmation. The question, then, is how we can escape the fortification of this lean. Is it possible to be free, to set ourselves straight by the act of critical thought? A man once said to me, "You speak of critical thinking, but you are not aware of what you speak. For all your thinking is contained within a certain channel." This forced me to reflect. What then is the point of critical thinking? Is critical thinking even possible? Here we have no choice but to make use of analogies. We must consider a man whose belief has been conditioned by society, a man whose belief is based on emotion. That is to say, he favors the conclusion. It renders him a certain amount of psychological pleasure. Shall we say, a Greek who favors the gods, one who confesses the existence of Zeus? Now, upon what principle is his belief founded? This is, of course, a rather complicated question because there are a multitude of precepts upon which his belief might be based. Let us say it was taught to him by his father, and out of respect, out of reverence for his culture, he took the belief serious. He is a good Greek, and like all good Greeks, he believes in the existence of Zeus. It is only radical and vile men, ignorant Greeks, who reject the idea of Zeus. And these men have little respect or power in the city. Why then would any good Greek, any respectable Greek, want to emulate them? For even if they have the truth, they lack popularity, which is to say, social acceptability. One can only imagine that if Socrates was not married, it would have been very hard for him to get a girlfriend. Now, is it possible for our Greek friend to challenge his conditioning? Can he break free of his suppositions regarding virtue and temperance? We are here introducing the concept of the question. Is it possible for our Greek friend to come into contact with a thinker such as John Stuart Mill, and learn the principles of critical thought. Indeed, our Greek friend, provided he has the added experience of coming into contact with Mr. Mill, which transcends his experience prior to Mill, can learn the principles of critical thought. He can then apply these principles to the propositions of his experience. We might call these authoritarian propositions because they have been established by authority as opposed to evidence or reason. That is to say, they are without proof. What then do we find in the analogy of our Greek friend? Though we admit, for the sake of time, our analogy is rather superficial. Is it true that we are conditioned? Is it true that we have the defect of bias? Is it true that no amount of critical thinking can help us overcome bias? Or is it rather the case that critical thinking is one of the most important tools against bias? The situation is thus. If I have an experience of eating fish, I cannot transcend that experience unless I am exposed to something else other than fish. That is to say, we combat experience by having different experience. We undo what has been done, or rather transcend it by doing the same thing. Only this time, we introduce new elements which were previously unknown to us before. How can we say this? Our Greek friend cannot escape the mechanism of experience, but he can use experience to regulate and qualify other forms of experience. We can say the same thing regarding logic. If it remains a fact that we are creatures of conditioning, then it is not so much a matter of trying to escape the mechanism of conditioning as it is a matter of controlling the nature of conditioning. And here we believe something constructive can be said. If we give a tree water, the tree will grow. But if we poison the tree with all kinds of noxious fluids, the tree is apt to die. Now, we can control the outcome of the tree, not by trying to overcome the paradigm of water, but by working within the paradigm of water. The same is true of human beings. We can essentially control the nature of our output by regulating the nature of our input. A wise man has learned that conditioning is the secret to substance. He merely sets about to regulate the nature of his conditioning. Thus, we speak of critical thinking as a kind of experience, as a kind of conditioning to which we can only say we were privileged to have been exposed. How much better off are we if we come into contact with the man or woman who shows us how to purify water, most specifically if we live in a forest with polluted streams? It is no different in the case of critical thought. Of course, at this point, it will be objected that the idea of transcending our conditioning smacks of naivety and circularity. For this assumes that we can get behind our conditioning in order to transcend our conditioning. But why is this not the case? For it's not so much a matter of getting behind as it is a matter of working within. Once we figure out, that is to say, become conscious of the fact that we are creatures of conditioning, then is it any wonder if we begin to think in terms of conditioning? That is, regulating our conditioning through the medium of conditioning? Of course, This implies that our experience is such that we can actually come to terms with a specific ontology. That is to say, that we are creatures of conditioning. And perhaps the tragic thing is that not all men come to terms with the fact of conditioning, which leaves them more or less impaired by their conditioning, imprisoned by ignorance. But have we done something wrong? Should we refrain from this articulation? Are we merely dabbling in the naivest form of realism? For even if this is the case, it is still incumbent on the objector to deal with the issue. At some point, he will have to draw the line. And here, we can only wonder if his line is any less problematic than our own. Critical thinking is not something our species has always known. It is not something we can all claim to know, and even thus do we only know it in degrees. It is a strange question to ask, but perhaps one that is entirely necessary. How critically can we really be in relation to our respective fields of knowledge? Or perhaps we might say, how critically can we think given our defect of bias? I posit that the nature of intelligence can largely be measured by how much a man or woman has escaped his or her defect of negative bias. The more we are prone to affirm any given proposition on the basis of credulity, the more we are limited in our capacity of criticism. And make no mistake, criticism is perhaps the most vital ingredient in the formation of intelligence. The more we can question our implicit assumptions, most specifically if those assumptions are negative, the more we can free ourselves from conditioning, even as the act of freedom is an act of criticism. Now, of course, there are several problems with this. What if our particular emphasis of conditioning is synonymous with intelligence? We might call this positive bias. That is to say, the nature of intelligence can largely be measured by how much a man or woman has succumbed to bias on the basis of credulity, which, mind you, in order to be established, does require proof. Not to mention, there are probably precepts more basic to intelligence than that of criticism. But nevertheless, the act of criticism is a vital ingredient to intelligence, unless we are criticizing ourselves out of intelligence by the act of criticism. But here we have the opportunity to fortify the authority of criticism by noting that we must use criticism in order to define the nature of intelligence. Hence, even if conditioning is synonymous with intelligence, we must still apply criticism in order to discern that intelligence is synonymous with conditioning. In this sense, ladies and gentlemen, the act of criticism is supreme. We are ready to admit that we have a defect in bias. But from this, can we measure the extent to which this bias restricts our perspective objectivity? With this question, we are immediately pulled in the direction of epistemology. We are forced to have the conversation of method. If I am a Greek, can I be objective in relation to the gods? For their existence has been fused with my psychology. My entire sense of stability is wound up in the nature of this mythology. The question is whether I am willing to part with my gods for the sake of a higher principle. The precept here should be taken as an analogy. In order to judge the gods, one must be willing to kill them. The man or woman who is not prepared to do this will forever be held in the grip of that which she loves. She must be willing to slay her lover for the sake of truth, which is perhaps the most fitting analogy for the affirmation and negation of propositions. But in raising the word truth, we have merely created a larger problem. We are now required to establish criteria, and this is precisely where the presuppositions of what it means to be a critical thinker can begin. For critical thought proceeds according to a logical standard. That is to say, it makes use of evidence and reason in order to evaluate the truth of any given proposition. Now, the tactic of the skeptic has been to undermine the authority of reason and nullify the power of evidence. But it must be noted, he cannot do this without relying on the very thing he seeks to reject. In order to deny the thing he hates, he must use the thing he denies. The fact is that we all must have a standard. Nay, the fact is that we all do have a standard. The question then is the identity of this standard. For I have learned that when a man or woman is epistemologically honest, their criticism draws from the well, that is to say, the authority of reason and evidence. This is because reason and evidence are the safest way to proceed. Of course, we admit that this formation is vague and that one can easily question what we mean by reason or evidence. Indeed, what qualifies as evidence? But suffice it to say, for the sake of our discourse, that there is no man or woman who can be free of the act of criticism. And when the identity of the authority of this act is defined, it is usually found to be some form of reason or some appeal to evidence. The question as to how objective we can be largely depends upon the nature of our method, which is to say, a certain kind of ontology or epistemology. For whether we know it or not, the authority of being does have relevance to the resolution of the question. There is such a thing as an ontology of refutation. And what more can we say, my friends? For we are not trying to dodge the question, but we are limited by time. If the Greek gods exist, and I believe in the Greek gods, I may have a poor method, though that method has caused me to believe the truth. But if the Greek gods are false, and I reject them on the basis of critical thought, if this method is directly responsible for my negation of a false premise, then we can only ask, what is the value of this method? On the other hand, if the Greek gods exist, and this method is directly responsible for my negation, then we can only ask, what is the value of this method? A poor method usually has a small field of application. Of course, one is encouraged to challenge this premise. Don't take my word for it, as Krishnamurti used to say. Do we have a method which can always guarantee the truth? It would be juvenile to give up critical thought simply because we lack an infallible method. The only relevant question to ask in light of criticism is whether or not it has value in relation to our existence. Let the listener try as he may. There is simply no way to avoid the value of criticism, as every attempt to do so will only end in the affirmation of the thing itself. Once again, and as with so many other things, the possibility of overcoming any given condition comes back to the possibility of transcendence. If it is possible to transcend the channels of experience, then it is possible to transcend our conditioning. If we can prove that experience transcends experience, then we can prove the effectiveness of the experience of critical thinking in contrast with other forms of experience. And how do we prove the possibility of transcending our experience? We note the channels of the mind. We document the current status of thinking. And then we ask whether or not we have ever had the experience of critical thinking. For what do we really know about this abstract thing? If the answer is no, it means our horizon is about to change. It means we are going to transcend our present experience in light of new experience. And the change here can either be positive or negative. But the thing to note is the actual possibility of transcending experience with experience. The hopeful fact that transcendence is available to us. We call this an optimism against the darkest lines of pessimism. So our conclusion is thus: even if our perspective objectivity is small, even if we lack certainty, even if we have no guarantee that critical thought can deliver objectivity, it is still better than the alternative. It is simply not enough to point out the defects in critical thought, for there is still no better remedy against conditioning our superstition than that of critical thinking. For the affirmation or negation of this proposition will determine the nature of one's life. The safest way for a man or woman to live is to live by the principles of critical thought. And this means the authority of reason and evidence in order to arrive at a more secure conclusion. For how else, my friends, can we get a slight edge over the power of subjectivity?